The Jester's Horse by Victoria, the Artisan's Heritage. Chapter 3. Peter. Within the kingdom walls, the environment was vastly different from the royal stable areas. It was bustling with townspeople, homes, and small marketplace areas. Training grounds for the knights were also housed within all of its vastness, where one could hear their armor clashing together at times. It was a sound that Peter all too well knew. On this morning, instead of waking up to the sounds of armor, he woke to the wonderful smell of bacon burning on the fire pit skillet that his mother, Angelica, started. He thought it was a much better way of waking up rather than having one of the high-energy neighboring boys named Thomas, who was age 13, nearly jump through his window to splash water on his head from a small wooden bowl. Peter would much prefer to be woken by the sounds of armor than by Thomas. "Wake up, Peter, wake up! You have to come now and teach me to fish while the fish are still here," Thomas would cry as his golden hair glistened in the dawn's rays of light along with his bright hazel eyes. While the light was approaching, it was still far too dark for Peter to want to awake naturally. But Thomas wanted to go out by the bustling and crisp creek before the roosters cawed in their part of the town. That was when, Thomas believed, the fish were most abundant. And he was always right. "I need to catch some for my family. I wasn't born with a brother, but I sure do know I have one now," Peter would say to Thomas quite groggily. Thomas truly did look up to Peter. He did come from a bit poorer family than Peter had, and was the only man of the house with his mother and little sister Carabelle. His father, who was a blacksmith, died when he was only 10 due to a terrible cough that turned into a deep heaviness in his chest that did not get any better despite their efforts to get him the help and the best treatments. Peter could hardly look past it, for he was a grown young man and knew it was important for Thomas to have an older mentor in his life to help guide him. Peter already had experience after all when it came to providing for his family, whenever needs arose. Peter's mother, Angelica, would sell gardening vegetables in the market, while his father, Bruce, was a local weapon forger, along with a few of the other men in the town. But today was different. Peter woke not to Thomas, but a bit later in the day at that, to this wonderful smell of bacon. He also got a whiff of freshly baked bread. His mother had not come in and scolded him for sleeping in late. She did not need his help in the garden today. She must have warned Thomas not to wake Peter up either. It was all very erratic today. Peter opened his eyes slowly as all of the thoughts passing through his mind became a bit clearer. Peter, who was 20, had a very handsome face and was very tall, slender, yet strong from all the hard work that he'd done all of his life. He lifted his dark brown eyes to the ceiling, then glanced at the smoke pit in his room that had already been lit. Finding this very strange, he thrust his upper body up and whipped the heavy blanket off of him, sat up on his bed, and ran his hands through his dark wavy hair. "It really is happening," he muttered under his breath. Peter stood up abruptly and took in a deeper breath and exhaled, which was followed by a long silence. Peter put on his work clothes, which consisted of buckskin trousers and a loose, long-sleeved shirt made of linen with thin, crisscross leather ropes at the collar tied together. He also very hastily latched his belt around his waist and stepped into his leather boots together before bursting through the door to the kitchen area of their quaint yet cozy home to find his mother dishing out slices of bacon in 3 wooden bowls and buttering bread. Their home was made of wood and a thatched roof that provided great warmth for the autumn and winter days. The window panes also provided cool air and breeze to circulate all throughout it during the winter months, as Thaladine was currently experiencing. "Peter, confound it, don't scare me. You're supposed to make people laugh like you always do, not stop their hearts," cried his mother. "So it's really happening then?" he questioned abruptly. Benny, the family's Irish wolfhound, jumped up off the floor in response to Peter's nervous excitement and walked over to him to lick his hand. He was half as tall as Peter and could be very intimidating to strangers unaware of his breed, but he was the most loyal and gentle of all companions. Benny gazed up at Peter with his golden eyes and mouth slightly open, panting excitedly. Peter gently laid his hand on top of his warm head in return. "Of course it's happening. Do you really think we'd be having bacon if it weren't so?" she said with a great smile, standing there and looking so very proud of her son. The smell of bacon continued to waver throughout the air. "But I suppose it really isn't going to be the same without you here and all the time, helping your mom with harvesting and being the man of the house while your father is working all day." Angelica's beaming smile melted into more of a frown as she thought about Peter's departure. Peter sat down on a wooden stool, still looking astonished. His mother pointed a wooden spoon towards him to proceed with lecturing him. "You didn't want to continue on making weapons with your father, nor marry any of the fine ladies here, so this was the next option. Finding you a true and steady career path, knowing that you are making a good living and a good name for yourself, and most importantly, knowing that you'd be happy and fulfilled with what you do." She scooted a bowl of delicious food in front of Peter, who quietly moved over from the wooden stool to sit at their larger wooden picnic-style table in front of the roaring fireplace. "You know, my boy," sighed Angelica, putting all of her cooking wares off to the side on the stone-cold countertop and taking a seat at the table directly across from him. Peter was looking down at his steaming hot bowl of porridge, milk, berries, and bacon. "I know you don't see it right now, but you have truly been blessed with an opportunity that doesn't come often. Granted, we're a good family, but the King Eliador doesn't offer this type of position just to anyone. I'm glad some of your homeschool education was of a benefit, counting the number of books you're always reading, but Peter, I want you to know this is an opportunity that comes once in a lifetime. It's far better an opportunity than even following in your father's footsteps or marrying into a fine townswoman's family." Peter managed to eat some of his bacon and buttered bread while pondering all that she said. "But Mom, I can't just be a laughingstock my whole life. Sure, I'm funny and quick-minded when it comes to that, but am I really that good? It's all just a bit of fun, that's all. Not to build my whole life around it." Angelica got up from the table, turned around, and walked over to the countertop to fidget for a piece of parchment paper that was rolled up into a scroll, held together by a single purple silk ribbon. She placed it on the table in front of Peter and sat back down opposite side of him. "The king thinks so," she said. "But is being a court jester really a life calling, a fulfillment?" Peter had stopped eating altogether and lost his appetite. "I know you don't understand it now, but being a court jester means an awful lot more than just making King Eliador smile. It means that you are now part of this kingdom's mission, its importance. You'll be learning a lot more about this role, and it stretches far beyond what you can see right now. I can assure you of that." "To tell jokes," Peter replied slowly, and making the job sound very unimportant. "My dear boy, do you realize that you will be entertaining the court? The court with the king himself? And probably more often than not, helping advise the members in all matters of importance that is involved for the future of the kingdom? Our kingdom? To help console the king in his worst state? That's what a true jester does. I guess you owe it to that Thomas boy for helping you obtain such a position," spoke Angelica with a twinkle in her eye and a silent smile on her face once again that seemed like she was trying to hide a laugh. "Even your father approves of such an opportune moment for a young man such as yourself, rather than crafting weaponry the rest of your life." Peter looked down at his breakfast that was turning more into a gruel for leaving it sit and stew altogether. He managed to take a few more bites, mainly finishing off the bacon and bread, drank his water down in a carved wooden cup, and took it all in for a moment. He truly did not want to make his mother and father. He truly did want to make his mother and father proud. He clasped his hands together around his cup before speaking once again. Peter was scholarly, wise, knew a lot about life and the different experiences that life brought to him so far, and he could solve nearly every problem that he faced. But he was also, indeed, very funny, even when not secludedly trying to be. Peter remembered back to the time his mother was referring to that involved Thomas and how he obtained a jester's title. Thomas and he were in a race, a serious one at that. Thomas, being the cheeky fellow that he was, had stolen Peter's last can of fishing worms, all out of good teasing humor, and Peter sought to get it back. As soon as Thomas ran into the yard of Mrs. Blackendew down the road, Peter tried to be funny and tackled Thomas into the laundry line and trapped him inside of one of Mrs. Blackendew's aprons. By the end of it all, the two had attracted a small gathering of bystanders, observing the commotion with laughter, as Thomas ended up appearing more mummified than anything. "And that is how, my dear citizens," said Peter eloquently to the bystanders, "how you teach young men to fish. They need aprons first in order to fillet their catch before ever daring to think about catching one." Peter drew the can of worms from Thomas's wrapped hands and even made a worm appear behind Thomas's ear as if by magic, and held it up in a grandiose way to present to the crowd, who began to burst out with laughter. Thomas, on the other hand, glanced down at his hands, wondering how Peter even took it from him. This laughter caught the eye of King Eliodor and his 2 knights who were out on patrol that day. Without saying a word, King Eliodor slipped Peter a scroll tied with silk purple ribbon and said nothing. Despite not knowing what the king had placed in his hands, Peter bowed profusely, as did the townsfolk among him. The crowd was getting closer and closer after the king left, saying, "What does it say? What does it say? Open it already." But Peter did not. He took it home and gave it directly to his mother. "I remember that day," said Peter, which didn't happen but 2 weeks prior. Peter's normal curiosity did not even bring him to wonder what the scroll had read. His normal lightheartedness turned nervous as he thought about it, so he simply went about his day. He did have his suspicions, though, which turned out to be rightly so. He knew the scroll would seal his fate. He had witnessed as a boy the king handing out such scrolls before him in front of the townspeople, who he rarely saw roaming the common folk's area after that. He felt the scrolls took people away from their lives rather than create organic opportunity. But that was merely Peter's perspective on the subject. Others, he now understands, may have rejoiced gratefully for the scrolls. He suddenly brought his thoughts back into the present moment. But why is it that the king had already wrote on the paper so specifically the title that I was to accept? Peter, it is because he was out that day giving needed jobs to qualified citizens. You should know that by now, as many books as you read. This doesn't happen but rarely. If the king needs a job to be done and there's no one among his court to fulfill it, he'll go out among the townsfolk. He will. Just like he did you. Peter's mother pointed her finger at him sternly, but lovingly. Peter loosened the grip that he had cusped around his wooden cup, knowing that his life was about to change drastically. He enjoyed humor, but he never knew that it would bring him to this very role. He was a man after all and was bound to set out in life sooner or later, but he'd miss his life here, his farming life. He'd miss tending to the garden and the livestock that this family had. He'd miss hearing of his father's stories about the weapons he would make for the knights, Though Peter was not often interested in how the weapons were crafted, he certainly was interested in how they were wielded by the knights. He'd missed pursuing his education and studies during his own solitude at home. He'd missed Benny, who had decided to lay back down on the wooden panel flooring right by Peter's feet, lifting his head gingerly to look up at him with sobby eyes. He knew and sensed in his heart that Peter was leaving, perhaps for good. But Peter, being wise for his youth, also thought about the fact that this gesture opportunity could get him closer to the royal library, closer to pursuing his studies, closer to perhaps doing something he actually liked, and maybe back eventually to his family after his duties and purposes to the kingdom were fulfilled. He thought about the new knowledge that he would gain to pass along to the rambunctious Thomas. But his heart still tugged over the fact of leaving his home for the longest time that he'd ever experienced. After Peter finished most of his breakfast before it turned stone cold, he sat silently and gloomily, lost in his thoughts. He decided to take one last stroll around town. Though it was his mother's suggestion for getting some fresh air and thinking on it for a bit, and perhaps even visiting his father for a moment's wisdom while he was forging out in the town's weapon forgery not too far from their home, Peter wanted to see his side of the quaint village they were nestled in through this current perspective one last time. He wanted to make an effort to also visit Thomas to say his last goodbyes for a great while. Thomas would now have to find someone else to go fishing and learn the ropes with. Peter's heart sunk deeper. He enjoyed being a mentor to Thomas. Maybe he would get to mentor others someday again. Peter stepped out of the home, shut the door quietly, and took in a deep breath. The air smelled of trees with a hint of baked ham and bread in the air from the nearby morning market. Their home was located on the outer part of the town, and it was considered more rural, but definitely more beautiful, in his opinion, than near to the castle itself. He set off and walked his normal path, not wanting to be known as a fool for the rest of his life. He didn't want to be mocked at. He just wanted to be himself. He was smart and knew a lot of history. Maybe, just maybe, he kept thinking on. Maybe, just maybe, he kept thinking on. This was a way for him to become more of who he wants to be, as his mother had alluded to. Maybe if he did gain the king's and court's trust, they would allow him to eventually become the court scholar or a knight. A knight would be far more perfect than a jester in Peter's eyes. A knight, thought Peter. His eyes glazed over with bewilderment at even thinking of that potential. He could not understand his feelings during that very moment, whether or not they were feelings of deep excitement finally or anxiety. He could simply not tell them apart right now. As Peter proceeded to walk down his family's farm's narrow pathway that met the dirt roads with neighboring homes all around them, one of which was Thomas's family, though not in poor condition, it was to a lesser degree than Peter's. The dirt pathway would eventually turn to cobblestone as he entered the town sections. He was trying not to become too critical of the situation. He glanced around at all of the nearby homes similar to his family's. Though they were overall well built and everyone had what they needed, often sharing various kinds of vegetables and livestock products among each other, he knew this path would automatically provide his family with a bit more comfortable life. At least one where they did not have to work as hard, and if they did, it could be something that they also enjoyed doing. Not just what they absolutely had to in order to make a living wage. He for once could provide for them as they did for him. Peter's family was not the poorest of poor, since his father was a tradesman and forger for the knights, but everything they had, they worked very hard for. Maybe they could eventually give back to others in the area, like Thomas's family, who they tried to help when they could. Peter approached the town's market and its cobblestone streets. He looked out among the horizon behind him to see rolling hills of gold and miles of land behind its outskirt village. Peter approached the town's market and its cobblestone streets. He looked out among the horizon behind him to see rolling hills of gold and miles of land behind his outskirt village. The trees were glorious, and the spring flowers in the fields were emerging more each day. Soon there would be ladies picking them in the field to provide as wares in the market. Soon the entire town would be smelling them, becoming so delicately intrigued over the floral aroma. Peter proceeded forward and glanced down at his favorite bread shop's table outside. He missed the breakfast rush, but there was still warm buttery bread on the table with jars of preserves that had just been prepared. Would it still look like this when I return in months? Thought Peter. Though Peter was only going to the castle nearby to live, he would not be able to just freely come and go to see his family and friends. That right almost certainly belonged to knights, perhaps the royal physician if granted the ability to be a freeman, noblemen and women, or the king himself and his kept-to-herself daughter of a princess. Peter never saw the princess and only heard about her through small talk. Some say she was quietly beautiful and cared for the people, while others said she kept to herself far too much and did not desire to make herself known to the ordinary people. Peter did not care much about it, nor had any preconceived perception of her himself. He had only hoped that whomever he encountered was gracious and kind and exhibit to all of the qualities that good royalty should exhibit, as Peter made remembrance of it in his studies and books about them. Further down the pathway, children were dancing outside the tavern, swinging ribbons around and playing tag. There came a delicious smell of soup from the tavern. It danced along and married together with a baked bread from the bread shop. Colorful, triangular-shaped flags lined up and down the marketplace areas and created a whimsical display when caught in the wind. Then, even further down the pathway, more and more townspeople emerged. There came a whiff of a combination of burnt metal and wood from the forgery shop Bruce, Peter's father, worked at. The smells to a non-native of the town were probably not good, mixed with the relatively close area that the food stalls and markets were located in, experiencing all of these various sights and smells at once. But this was the smell Peter grew up with. It was the smell of home. The bustling streets and strange smells that simply continued on and forevermore. The village became more and more bustling, with some people looking joyful, others overcome by their hard, laborious tasks, and some, like the upcoming and emerging flower sellers, who were trying to woo Peter into purchasing the first of the crops because it would keep him looking handsome as ever, as they'd say. Peter felt that he might as well become an old, ugly toad after even just living a month in that dark, damp castle that he envisioned. Though it was grand and beautiful from the outside, he had no idea what to expect at all inside of the castle, except for the things he had read about. Most kingdoms' castles were cold and dark, lifeless, as one of Peter's books he obtained from a merchant when he was young said. Peter brought his thoughts back to the present moment and declined the sale of the flowers, risking himself looking like a toad. A toad, yes. That might be even better, Peter secretly wished. I'll be so ill-faced in appearance they'll have to throw me out.